This is Word on the Streets, a podcast about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. This podcast is created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 7 of Word on the Streets, a podcast about information, updates, and perspective on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project in Midland, Michigan, and beyond. I'm your host, Katie Geyer. As we mentioned on this podcast before, the Buttles Project and nearly every other project we take on at the city doesn't happen in a vacuum. Initiatives are the result of careful planning and alignment with a greater vision for the kind of community that we want to build. Today, we're going to talk about that greater vision and how you all can play a huge role in bringing it to life. I'm excited to welcome back to the podcast today somebody you have all met for the first time back here earlier in the year, Director of Planning and Community Development, Jacob Kain. Jacob, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Katie. It's nice to be back.
Awesome. So you've had a really busy few months since you started working at the city. That's probably an understatement. We're going to talk all about Midland City Modern Master Plan and the exciting progress that we've made on that update so far. But first, we do have some Buttles-related content that we need to talk about. There was some action at the council level in the last couple weeks, so let's talk a little bit more about that. At the November 21st City Council meeting, Council received a request from the public about the corridor improvement project, and they actually passed a resolution as a result of that request. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So Michigan Department of Transportation's in their design phase for the Indian and Buttles Street project, which is part of the larger business route US 10 reconstruction. And the correspondence from Michigan Baseball Foundation basically asked if City Council was willing to take a policy stance on the design of Indian Street. As you know, Buttles Street City Council has already indicated their support for MDOT's plans to reconfigure that road into a two-lane cross-section. And so there hasn't been a public stance on Indian Street to date. They also asked if anyone had taken a stance on basically the alignment of the roadways through the corridor. So looking at the curb to curb, with lane reductions, there's an opportunity to rethink where those curb lines fall. And with the interest in basically increasing the amount of buffering and the distance of the street from those abutting properties. And so council's action was to have staff reach out to MDOT to have conversations about those alignment questions. There wasn't ultimately any direction on Indian Street itself. As you might expect, we've been working in the planning and engineering departments, especially really closely with MDOT staff for many years now on the design parts of this project, trying to ensure that the goals that were established by the city for the project are met, which includes safety along the corridor as a really important goal. And so we are continuing to work with them as they move towards their next phase of design. We're hoping we'll see some plans out early next year, and then we'll be able to continue to comment and work with them as we get closer to their construction timelines in 2025.
Okay. So how does the resolution that they passed on November 21st change the scope of the existing Buttles project, or does it even change anything at all?
This doesn't have any impact. So basically, because we'd received the inquiry and it was directed at City Council for feedback, we brought it forward for them to weigh in on. But essentially, the actions taken by Council don't change anything about prior authorizations that they'd already made for staff to work with MDOT on implementing the design vision that was already established. And it maintains the current status quo where we do have MDOT moving forward on design with a two-lane cross-section on Buttles Street with turn lanes, right turn lanes at certain locations, and a three-lane cross-section on Indian Street.
Okay. So when we had John Kelly from MDOT on the podcast back in August, he anticipated we would see another round of designs in early Q1. You've kind of said the same thing, so we'll kind of sit tight on those. Really looking forward to having him back on the podcast to talk about those when we have those in our hands. So in that same thought, there's another city initiative that we've kind of talked about before on this podcast that actually plays a role in the Indian and Buttles project, and that is the future of Ashman and Rodd streets. So we've been talking about this since as far back as episode 1 of season 2 in January. If you want to go take a look at that episode previously, It's my understanding that the future of those corridors as two-way versus one-way streets is now going to go to City Council with the opportunity for them to take some action. Jacob, can you tell our listeners what's going to be happening at the December 19th City Council meeting?
Sure. So, City Council authorized staff to go out for bid on a capacity analysis for Ashman and Rodd streets from Center City, so essentially Cambridge Street and Saginaw Road to the north, into downtown for the entirety of those corridors to look at the feasibility of two-way conversion, essentially to confirm from a traffic flow perspective only whether or not a conversion from one-way traffic to two-way traffic was going to create any traffic flow issues. And so ultimately, OHM Advisors was contracted to do that study. That study is now finished. And so we'll be presenting the results of that study to council on Monday night, and we'll also be looking for some direction from them on next steps. At this point, the recommendation is to continue with some additional analysis north of Indian Street and to authorize conversion to two-way traffic from Indian Street into the downtown.
Okay, so there's a reasoning why all this timing of the study is happening right now. MDOT needs traffic flow direction to properly engineer and signal Ashman and Rodd with Buttles for this current project. And we talked extensively in season 2, episode 1 about why converting Ashman and Rodd to two-way streets is a potential opportunity that we're looking at. They've even been two-way streets in the past, all the way through the corridor. So what information is going to be shared with council as a result of the study that OHM did?
So essentially, we're just trying to provide some historical context on how we got to today. There's been a lot of discussion about the corridors in recent years, and even going back further. When we looked at the downtown Midland streetscaping project about 5 to 7 years ago, there was a significant amount of public engagement that took place about what that streetscape was going to look like. Part of that work was looking at Ashman and Rodd streets within downtown Midland and looking at what the future of those streets should be. And coming out of that, it was identified that two-way conversion offered a lot of benefits to the downtown district in terms of safety, in terms of access, visibility of businesses, etc. And so ultimately, when that streetscaping plan was adopted, that included a recommendation that two-way conversion take place. Obviously, so far, the city's made a lot of progress with Main Street, with the new streetscaping, which is wonderful. As we move forward, we'll need some direction on how Ashman and Rodd streets are handled, if there's any streetscaping work done. And as you said, MDOT specifically with their corridor project in 2025, in order to properly design the intersections of Ashman and Rodd with both Indian and Buttles, they need direction from the city on whether those are one-way or two-way traffic patterns. And so that puts some time sensitivity to the project. That's why we ultimately did go out for the traffic flow analysis, so that we could put council in a position of being able to make an educated decision on the future of those streets within downtown Midland.
Sure. So I do want to point out to our listeners that we are recording this episode prior to the meeting on December 19th. So obviously council hasn't taken any action yet, but we will publish all of the information after the meeting, including a video, so you can go ahead and watch what happened at that meeting. We'll also link to all of the presentation documents that Jacob will be presenting on the podcast website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors, so you can take a look at that presentation and see the council discussion, and ultimately, if council decides to take any action, what that is. So we obviously don't know what they're going to decide at this point. So if we talk in generality here, what is the city staff recommendation on the future of Ashman and Rodd? What are we going to be asking council to actually do?
So there's two main things we'll be recommending that they consider on Monday night. The first is having to do with downtown Midland. So we've got significant amounts of public engagement. There was some traffic analysis conducted in conjunction with the downtown streetscaping plan. We've now replicated that traffic capacity analysis through the OHM study. And what we've really found is that within the downtown district, there's no adverse traffic flow impacts whatsoever from a two-way conversion. And so given all the identified benefits, given the strong public support that was identified within the downtown streetscaping outreach, given the time sensitivity associated with the MDOT project, we're recommending that we go ahead and give MDOT the direction that we will be pursuing that two-way conversion in the future. This doesn't mean that the two-way conversion will be implemented immediately. Obviously, there'll be some timing considerations both for the MDOT project as well as for on the city budget side to see when it makes the most sense to implement this. But this will provide MDOT with what they've told us they need, which is design direction so that they can complete signal designs, intersection and turn lane designs, et cetera, at those 4 intersections.
Sure. So what we're looking at right now is really from Buttles Street into the downtown district.
This would be from Indian into
Okay,
downtown.
from Indian into downtown. And then from Indian to, let's say, the Circle could potentially be implemented at a later date.
Yeah, so that's the second part of the recommendation. Because we've had less public engagement to the north, the Center City Redevelopment Plan, which was adopted by City Council in 2019, does talk about and acknowledge the fact that there's some consideration of eventual two-way conversion of both Ashman and Rodd streets, and looked at the design options for Saginaw Road and whether or not those would work in a two-way scenario. And basically that study found that two-way scenario would be feasible. It would be complementary with those design options, as would a one-way scenario. And so we'd like to, in this next phase of study and analysis north of Indian Street, do some additional community engagement, do some additional renderings and design exercises to determine what really makes the most sense for the remainder of the two corridors.
Okay. So you can watch the Ashman and Rodd study presentation and the council discussion and any potential action they take. And you can also go back to season 2, episode 1 and get some more details about kind of how this project came to fruition at the podcast website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. We're going to take a quick break and stop for a minute here. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 7 of Word on the Streets. Today we're here with Director of Planning and Community Development, Jacob Kain. So Jacob, in the first segment, we talked about updates on infrastructure. Now we're going to talk about something I know is very near and dear to your heart, and that is the City Modern Master Plan update. For residents who aren't familiar with what a master plan is, it's kind of like an instruction manual for building and maintaining a city. But can you explain in a little more detail about why that's so important?
Yeah, so you're right. The master plan is, there's a lot of different ways you could describe it. It's a roadmap. It's a vision document. It's a policy document. So it basically articulates what does the community want to see. How does the community want to see itself in the future? Typically, you define a particular time horizon. So in our case, we've been generally working towards the year 2050. So just a little bit more than 25 years into the future, to say what, the next mid-century, what does Midland look like? How does it operate? What types of housing and employment do we have? How are our parks, our streets used? This is a lot could change in that time period. And so we want to be ready for what's coming in the future.
Sure.
And so that's why it's important. I hope we're going to spend some time talking about how impactful past master plan processes have been.
Yeah.
This really gives us a chance to think hard about what we need and what we want to see in the future, what we expect might be coming our way, so we can be prepared. And hopefully we can ensure that the community remains a really successful and desirable place to live.
Sure. So a good master plan, as I think we've talked about before, is really a community-wide document that everyone has some ownership in. But I know your department in particular and the Planning Commission utilize the master plan a lot. Can you talk a little bit more about how your department specifically utilizes the master plan for planning and community development?
Sure. So as we're doing our zoning work, so as we look to implement land development rules within the community, the future land use assignments of individual properties within the community is a really important consideration. That helps to ensure that as sites develop and redevelop, that they're done in a manner that's consistent with the anticipated future context. It also enables us to look at our infrastructure decisions, and if we're making a decision about maybe installing a new water line, knowing what's coming or what's likely to come in terms of a land use in the future can help us to size those facilities appropriately, whether we're looking at them being smaller or bigger. We can make the right investment decision for the community on a long-term basis. So it's really about planning. I love, you find those cartoons of somebody who's got a telephone pole in the middle of their driveway. You want to think ahead, and being able to think ahead about our investments and our decisions enables us to ensure that we're making sound decisions that are going to really stand the test of time going forward.
Sure. So we've talked about what it looks like to see the vision of a master plan come to life on the podcast before, especially as it relates to the Buttles Street redesign and to the Center City redevelopment plan, things like that. Let's talk about past master plans. If people look around in the community, they're actually seeing the results of past successful master plans. Can you talk a little bit about some of the big projects we've seen, let's say maybe even the last 50 to 100 years, based on previous master plan projects?
Sure. So City has a great history of doing proactive planning and really visionary planning. And so going back to our first city plan, which was adopted in 1928, This was actually
Oh my
like a
goodness.
community-initiated plan. So as we've been digging into the history and learning a bit more, this was initiated actually by the Kiwanis Club. So
Okay.
there was an identified need for a plan. There was a desire to have some direction for the future of the community. And as you read that plan, it's really interesting to think about 100 years ago how different Midland really was. Midland was a really small community then, especially in comparison with the other, with our two sister cities in the Tri-Cities. Midland was very small, and our main industry was chemicals. It was a chemical plant, and if you think about industrial practices of the time, as you read the descriptions about Midland, it doesn't sound like Midland today. They described it as really not being a beautiful place. It's there's industry and there's really not much else. And
Right.
so there was an identification that having a beautiful community was really important to people, which is one of those things where you go, wow, like that's really played out over the last 100 years, because that's one of the first things descriptors people use when they talk about Midland today is that it's a really beautiful place. Some of the more tangible things that we've seen is, number one, US 10 at that time ran through downtown Midland. And so an identification of a need to really remove that through traffic out of the downtown. And so at that time, there was an identified bypass route, which is today's Saginaw Road through Center City. So this is before the circle, before Saginaw Road even existed as a road.
Wow.
Through that part of town. That was identified on a map in that 1928 plan. You also see, even back in those days, flooding was a big concern.
Mm-hmm.
People were a lot less thoughtful about where they put structures back then, and they'd already suffered some pretty dramatic issues due to flooding, washing out of bridges, things that really had a huge impact on the community. And so thinking about what's the flood strategy for the community? How do we stop building in the wrong places and start building in the right places? And what do we do with that land that's left over? And then you see things like Emerson Park and other areas of the community arise out of those efforts to identify a good floodplain management strategy.
Sure.
As you move further into more recent era, back in our 1946 and 47 comprehensive plan, we had a community center located in downtown Midland, and you see the first indication of possibly relocating and building a new community center in Central Park, which obviously we're in the process of now building the second community center in that location, which is really exciting for the community. But that's one of those really, fundamental changes to the community that continues to persist today. The other really interesting item in that plan is back in those days, there were two main ways to get from Midland to the west. We had two bridges. So we had the Curry Bridge, the Curry Parkway Bridge, and we had the Benson Street Bridge. That's how you could get in and out of Midland, and those were really small bridges. So it was a real issue trying to get people in and out of the community. So there was an identification of a need for a new bridge crossing of the Tittabawassee River. What's interesting to me in that plan is the identified location for that crossing is actually to align with Ashman Street instead of Jerome as it does today. So we would have potentially had M20 coming into the community at Ashman Street, basically where the church is located today, and into downtown. Obviously, for whatever reason, that didn't come to pass, and the bridge was ultimately built at Jerome. But if you think about what that might have looked like and how that would have shaped Midland in a very different way, potentially a huge impact. But we did ultimately get the important part of that improvement, which was a better, more viable connection to the west. As we get out into the nearer time, we had a 1972 plan looking at the year 2000, and you see a lot of street projects come out of that. So things like Eastlawn Drive and its extension to Waldo Avenue is identified in that plan. You have some extensions of St. Andrews from Eastman West to Main Street in that plan, and the full exchange at Bay City Road and US 10. And so, again, things that continue to have a huge impact on the community going forward. You also see the first kind of conversations about neighborhood commercial. So that's an area of some pretty significant outward growth of the community, and the commercial development didn't necessarily follow it. So when you look at Plymouth Square at Swede and Wheeler is a great example of that vision. And if you look in that plan, you can see some visioning documents that it's almost as if that development was patterned after it. So I think you can thank that 1972 master plan for that development in particular. Finally, moving into more of the contemporary era, we have things like the whole concept of the Indian and Buttles Street Boulevard. I think a lot of people today take for granted, but back in the day, Bay City Road connected into the Eastman and Buttles Street corridor, and you didn't have the Grand Curve. So that's a relatively recent modification to the community. And this plan, the Task Force 2000 plan, really talked about what's that corridor look like. This is an important gateway into Midland. It's an important gateway into our industrial area as well as our downtown. So how do we improve that area in the best interest of the long-term viability of the community? And then finally, in our most recent planning efforts, we have some identification of needs like creating a center city authority, which we talked a little bit about what's up in the city planning edition today about some important movement in the center city authority. We talked about expanding residential options downtown, and we've had great success with that and hope to continue to over the next several years. We also talked, you might not be surprised to hear traffic in front of Midland Mall. So, in that era, there were some big problems, and the city's invested, along with MDOT, a lot of time, energy, and money into making some improvements there to make that area more safe and accessible for the community. So some really cool things that have come to pass. Really, to me, helps to illustrate why people's participation in these processes is important, because it can have real and lasting change that can span generations.
Sure. And like everything that we experience to some degree living in our community is impacted by the master plan, past master plans, and the current master plan we're working on now. So a lot of that stuff is extremely visionary, like you said, and it's really transformed the way Midland is today. But are there some items that you've come across in your research from past city master plans that have actually not been implemented?
That's a great question. I mean, I like to read old plans because I think they keep me humble about the ability of planners to know the future. Mm-hmm. We certainly do our best to anticipate what the opportunities and threats that we face as a community might be in the future, but you can't always get it perfectly right. And so, there's everything from some population projections in the past that really didn't come to play. If you think about, the era of the, 1970s, we're coming out of the baby boom. Mm-hmm. And I think there was an assumption that those trends were going to continue forever.
Sure.
And so, a Midland of 60,000 people by the year 1990 was completely within people's grasp as an idea that made sense. Obviously, that didn't come to pass.
Right.
There's a lot of demographic changes that fed into that not taking place. Something else that is really interesting is we have a 1972 downtown plan. It's probably the most interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk about this. I'm looking at these pictures. And if you want to go to the Corridors website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors, we're going to throw some of these images up here. If you're watching on video, you'll see them on screen. But if you're listening on audio, you need to check these out because they are very interesting. So tell us what we're looking at here, Jacob.
Yeah, so we've got this study for the Central Business District of Midland, our downtown, and essentially it sort of aims to turn downtown into a shopping mall. So we've got enclosure of Main Street with a roof structure, some new buildings, it appears, located under that roof structure, totally pedestrianized. No vehicles permitted within the district, really kind of moving vehicles to the periphery. We have a glass roof over Ashman Street, north of Main Street, with, a very mall-like atmosphere.
Don't worry, we still have trees in there, though. Midland loves trees. There are inside trees.
There's still trees. I mean, a potential closure of Ashman Street at Buttles, so putting a government complex there. I think, like any plan, you can see echoes of this plan, even though a lot of this didn't come to reality. You do see echoes of elements of this plan and some of the decision making that took place in the ensuing years. So, having a government complex back in 1972, we wouldn't have had the city hall and county building complex that we have today.
Right.
But you can see how this idea might have planted the seed for what ultimately was constructed in downtown Midland. Obviously, future streetscaping ideas also kind of, didn't take the mall idea to quite the extreme that this plan would have taken it, but it did begin to move things and, thinking about the pedestrian experience and how do you be competitive with what, at that time would have been Fashion Square Mall and Saginaw being the main competitor, but how do you make downtown Midland keep it as a vibrant and vital retail environment? And those are questions that every community continues to grapple with today, including Midland. How do we keep those important districts of our community vital, not just today, but in the future?
Yeah, that's wild to look at this, for example. This plan was developed 50 years ago now, and we still see inklings of that even today because we have the Commons pedestrian plaza that we're now closing Main Street to vehicle traffic in much of the area that this is shown on the master plan, prioritizing the pedestrian experience, prioritizing, the gathering place as opposed to vehicle parking and traffic. And when we first implemented the Commons, a lot of people thought that was a new idea. That was a crazy idea. We can pull back to 50 years ago. Planners were starting to think about that and how we make that a part of our downtown experience. Pretty cool stuff. So I know community input is super critical to a successful master plan. And we've had a lot of moving parts over the last couple of years. We've had a combination of some online surveys. We've had some pop-up planning studios over the past several months. We even did a bar crawl, which is pretty fun. We were at Coffee Chaos. And you guys actually had an event last night at the Civic Arena during a Midland High hockey game. So you've kind of been all over the community, talking to people from all walks of life, just doing what they do, getting a lot of different demographics, a lot of areas. What kind of feedback are you hearing during these sessions, and how is that going to be useful for you when you're updating the master plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've really enjoyed our time out in the community, talking with folks. We made the decision as we entered this current phase of the project that in order for us to be successful, we had to get outside of City Hall, and we really had to get to where the people were. And not necessarily expect the people to come to us. And so that's been extremely powerful as we've had conversations with people. I would say, as a new person to the community, one of the things I've been struck with across the board is how much people care and love Midland, care for and love Midland. It's just almost universal, even when people have complaints, even when people have experienced hardships like through the flood. People really care about this community, and so that's just wonderful and very heartwarming as a planner to see and hear. So that's been one of the common threads. The other thing I would say is that because we've been really deliberate about being in different places where we'll catch people from different walks of life, I've been really struck by how much consistency there is in the feedback. So the types of things we're hearing from the Planning Commission, which is charged with really creating this plan, 9 members of the community that are appointed to the Planning Commission. But whether we've been downtown at the bar crawl, or we've been at Coffee Chaos in the morning, or we've been at the hockey arena, and whether we've been talking to younger people, older people, homeowners, renters, we are getting a lot of similar feedback.
Okay.
So that's fantastic, because what that tells us is there's consensus around a lot of issues, and that makes it a lot easier to, I won't say that makes creating the plan easier. That makes implementing the plan easier.
Okay.
Because we know there's community support for these ideas. So we're really excited about that. The other nice thing is that every once in a while we do have somebody come up with a really new idea that nobody's raised, but that's a good idea that has merit. And so we've been able to include that in the list as well, and be able to think about ways that we can incorporate that in the ultimate vision document, the goals, objectives, and strategies that are really going to be critical to implementation as we move forward.
Sure. So can you give us a little sneak peek? I know we've got plenty of time until draft adoption. What are some of the key themes that are coming out of people's conversations with you?
Sure. So one theme I'll highlight is that we've heard from almost every group that we've talked to has been neighborhood commercial. People, a lot of people have talked to us about how they walk and bike. A lot of people. They, whether it's they wake up early in the morning, or they come home late at night and they go for a walk just to get their steps in, or they're out with their dog or children, or, they're more serious athlete and they're out training. People are really committed and passionate to having that opportunity, and they really value that about Midland, that it provides that. But what we don't really provide for a lot of folks in the community is places, destinations to walk to. And so for large parts of the community, we lack that neighborhood commercial that people are really interested in. So we've heard from a lot of people that they'd like to have some, small scale neighborhood commercial that was available to them and their neighbors in their neighborhoods. And so that's, again, been almost across the board something that we've heard from people, that they'd really like that convenience factor. They'd like to have something that was, not 10 or 15 minutes away, because Midland obviously offers a lot of convenience today to most residents, but, a 5 or 10 minute walk to be able to go and get bread, eggs, or milk, maybe to get gasoline for their car. We've heard a lot of feedback from folks in the northeast part of Midland about, the lack of accessible gas stations, that it's quite a distance just to get to that, and the convenience that those stores also offer to a neighborhood. And so that's come up quite a bit. We've had a lot of conversations around infrastructure. Unsurprisingly, we've come out of 2 very important flooding events in the community that have impacted a lot of our residents directly, and so a lot of conversations around infrastructure. Not all flood related, but many of them flood related. So really thinking about what our infrastructure needs are over the future. We've talked a lot about housing. So we've heard from a lot of folks who've talked about, not really being able to find the type of housing that they're looking for in Midland, We've talked to some folks because we're out in the community. We're interacting sometimes with people that don't live in Midland proper today, but they work, they shop. Maybe their kids go to school in Midland, and so talking to them about maybe why they aren't living in Midland, whether it's issues with affordability, issues with access, or just not finding the housing product that they want within our city limits. And so trying to think about ways that we can address that so that we can ensure that Midland continues to experience positive growth and success in the future.
Sure. So speaking of, this being a future plan that we need, feedback from all walks of life and all stages of life, if you will. One of the coolest initiatives that I've seen come out of this process so far is something you're still working on, but it's something we've not really previously done very successfully with any city initiative that we've done before, to my knowledge. We're getting feedback from future generations that are actually going to see this master plan completely implemented during their childhood and young adulthood. Tell our listeners a little more about the work you've been doing with City Modern as it relates to Midland Public Schools.
Great, yeah, and I will say that's another thing we've heard from the general public as we've talked is a lot of people are concerned about whether or not the young people in Midland today are going to stay in Midland in the future. And I think they've seen in past generations how we've lost a lot of young people to other communities around the state and country as they've grown up and moved on with life. And so we thought it was really important to recognize we have a huge population of young people in this community, 18 and under, and to find a way for us to reach them and to talk about two things, really. What's their experience as a young person? People in Midland really value that this is a family-friendly place, and so we want to understand, what makes it family-friendly and what can make it ensure it's family-friendly in the future. So no better way to really know that than to talk to parents and kids.
Right.
And so we were looking for an opportunity to talk to kids about that, but also the 2050 window, today's high schoolers are going to be in their early to mid 40s in the year 2050. So they're going to be probably owning houses, working in their career, the midpoint of their career. They may have high schoolers themselves. So what do they want Midland? What does Midland need to be like in 2050 to really meet their needs? So we reached out to Midland Public Schools, and we were very excited that they were very excited to partner with us on this project. They're obviously very interested in creating civic-minded students.
Sure.
And ensuring that they understand how they can shape and impact the world as they become adults. And so we have this is exceeding our wildest dreams, really, I guess is what I would say. We are working at all levels of the schools. So we've already done outreach with Midland High School. That was just last week. Had an opportunity to meet with about 100 students across 4 sessions. Got some really amazing feedback. Students these young people are extremely thoughtful. Like everybody else we've talked to, they really care about Midland. They want Midland to be a successful place. And we got just some fantastic feedback from those students. We'll be meeting with the middle schools next week. So we'll be meeting with both Jefferson and Northeast middle school students next week. And then after the first of the year, we've got sessions set up with H.H. Dow High School and their student leadership to get their feedback. And as part of this, we're also at the elementary school level. Obviously, we have a lot more elementary schools, a lot more classrooms. We only have 2 planners on staff, and so we can only spread ourselves so thin. And so we're going to be doing teacher-led outreach in the elementary schools next year. And so really getting the youngest members of the community engaged to find out what it's like being, an elementary-aged kid in Midland today. How can we make Midland an even better place for elementary-age kids in the future? And then how can we make Midland the kind of place that they want to live in as they grow into adulthood? So this is really exciting. I think it would be impossible to adequately understand what our future needs are without talking to the people who really, as you said, are going to be the most impacted by that future.
Sure. So I know, like you said, you're just kind of at the tip of the iceberg of collecting feedback from school students. But can you tell me a little bit about some of the feedback you're hearing from younger people? Is it similar or different to other feedback from some of the other methods that you've used previously?
So they're another group that the feedback is, there's a lot of consensus in this community about needs. It's been, I think the students see many of the same issues that adults see in the community, and it may be that through talking with their parents or other adults in their life that they're picking up on these things. But we definitely, they identified challenges themselves that were challenges that others have also identified for us through our earlier engagement efforts. But we also heard, some specific things, whether it was, for teens, really looking for how they fit into the event space in the community. So them feeling kind of disconnected from things in a way that they didn't when they were younger.
Okay.
So a lot of feedback talking about how, up until they were, maybe 12 years old, feeling like Midland was really bent over backwards as a community to make it a great place for them, but maybe not feeling that way anymore as they moved into their later teen years. And so we got to have some really productive conversations about, well, what would that look like? I obviously pushed back a little and said, when I was 16 or 17, I'm not sure if, my home city had sponsored an event that me or my friends would have necessarily thought that was for us or thought it was cool and would have gone.
Sure.
And really trying to understand, well, what would that look like?
Yeah.
What kinds of things would you be interested in? And so, the one thing that also really resonated with me is they were really appreciative of being asked. I think that it was clear that they don't always get asked and maybe don't always feel like their feedback is valued. And so we certainly strongly value their feedback. I will actually next week be meeting with a couple of staff at the city to talk about some of that feedback, because I think there's some things that we heard that are actionable before we even get to master plan adoption, some things that we could be responsive to some of that feedback now, and potentially do a better job of meeting the needs of those young people today.
Yeah, I'd like that you brought that up, because I was going to mention that a lot of what we might be hearing, it helps to feed that master plan and that future vision, but some of it is actionable stuff that we can utilize now, whether it's through the capital improvement plan, whether it's through some of the events that we put on, whether it's through recreational amenities, parks amenities, things like that, even communication. Communication grows and changes so much that people coming out to these events are providing this feedback. I want them to understand they might not have to wait 25 years to see what they're telling us they need from the community actually happen and become a reality. It's really important that this is a very fluid process. We're creating this master plan, but this is also a great opportunity for us to kind of gut check, are we doing the things that we really should be doing to meet the needs of residents now? So I'm interested to see how these results keep feeding that master plan, but also feeding the way that we're currently operating as a local government. So you talked a little bit about what we're doing with the schools. What can all residents expect to see happening with City Modern as we head into 2023?
So we will be shifting gears a bit as we move into 2023, really getting deeper into the details of the plan. And so, as you know, in phase one of the project, which largely occurred prior to my arrival in Midland, it was really about the big picture stuff. So let's talk broad strokes. What are the themes? What are the main things that we need to be focused on as we go in this planning effort? This current phase has really been about answering the question of, okay, within those broad themes, what are the actual tangible things we need to be working on? And as we move forward, we're going to really be talking about the details. So if we've identified that we have a need for neighborhood commercial, where is that need? So let's look at the map. Let's talk about where that need is and how would we make that happen? Are there regulatory changes that are needed? Are there incentives that are required? What are the things that we can do that are actionable over the next 5 to 10 years that would help to move that vision forward? And so this gets to be pretty exciting. As we do that, we're going to be also kind of shifting the gears on our public outreach. So we're going to be continuing to do public outreach, but a little bit of the dynamic of what we're asking the public for is going to change as we get more into those operational aspects. So we have our next pop-up event scheduled in January. We're going to be out at Senior Services Trailside. Cool. On Dublin Avenue. We're really excited for that lunch and learn session. In February, we're going to be partnering with the Greater Midland Community Center to host an open house event at the Midland Community Center, and that'll be a chance for the public to really weigh in on the priorities that have been identified in the plan and make sure that the Planning Commission's vision and the community's vision are in full alignment as we move into drafting. As we get in the middle part of the year, we're going to be releasing a draft plan, and we do hope that draft plan is ready for adoption by fall of 2023.
Awesome. And there will be some additional surveying opportunities as well on some different topics, I understand. So please make sure that you are following the City Modern Master Plan website. That's where you can find info on all these events, any additional survey opportunities, ways you can get involved. You can even sign up for the email newsletter so you can be informed immediately right in your email inbox as soon as things are planned. And that website is midlandcitymodern.com. So like Jacob said, be on the lookout for more information on how you can get involved in the City Modern Master Plan update beginning in January of 2023. Jacob, as always, it's been awesome having you here. Great time as always. Thank you so much for all your insight, and I hope that you will come back again once we kind of get further down the path, update us on what's going on in the schools and kind of how the draft plan is coming as we get closer to the adoption date.
Thanks, Katie. We appreciate the opportunity to get the word out to the Midland community about the work we're doing, and we really appreciate the community's really strong levels of engagement with us so far.
Perfect. Well, that's all for this installment, but we'll be back soon with another episode and more updates on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project and other infrastructure in our community. See you soon, slow down, and have a wonderful holiday season. This has been Word on the Streets, a podcast created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. For more information on this podcast or to learn more about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project, visit cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors.